Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today on hand for review I have the XFX Radeon RX 5700 XT THICC 2. And not too thick like some of the guys in our comment section, but THICC 2. Calm down guys, it's just a joke. Okay, so now that we've got a healthy amount of dislikes on this video, let's get into it. Given the name, you might expect this to be an overly wide graphics card, but by today's standards for a mid-range to high-end graphics card, it is pretty typical. The THICC 2 takes up 3 expansion slots as it measures 54mm wide, making it about 4mm wider than the MSI Duke OC and 3mm wider than the Power Color Red Devil. So it is wider than the recently reviewed 5700 XTs here at Hardware Unboxed, but only by a bee's wiener. Lengthwise, it measures 290mm long while it stands 115mm tall. So again, nothing outrageous here. The card weighs in at 1153 grams, which is up there. Certainly much heavier than the 889 gram Evoke, but a little bit lighter than the 1254 gram Red Devil. As for the design, I rather like the look of it. On the front, we have a pair of 95mm fans, and I like the chrome detailing found around the edge of the fan housing. It's quite an elegant design. You'll find no RGB lighting here. In fact, the only LEDs to speak of are some blue LEDs on the PCIe power connectors. The fan shroud's been made from plastic, but on the backside we do find an aluminium backplate. The backplate features a number of cutouts which look visually impressive, and they'll no doubt help vent some built-up heat from the backside of the PCB. Also, next to the PCIe power connectors, we find a small cutout which provides access to a little switch on the PCB. XFX says this allows users to switch between the default OC profile and then a silent profile. However, I found virtually no difference between the two modes in terms of temperature and fan speed. Moving on, around at the I/O panel, we have a pretty standard configuration, I think it's fair to say. 3 display ports and a single HDMI port. So at this point, I think it's time we rip the cooler off for a better look at the PCB as well as the cooler itself. Okay, so let's start with the cooler. The heatsink alone weighs 511 grams, and that makes it 44% heavier than the piddly little heatsink we find on the MSI Evoke. That said, it is still 26% lighter than the heatsink found on the Power Color Red Devil. So while it is reasonably beefy, there are bigger, heavier options available. One of the reasons the Red Devil cooler is so much heavier is down to that large nickel-plated copper baseplate, which covers not just the GPU, but also the GDDR6 memory chips. XFX, on the other hand, have included a smaller copper baseplate and then used an aluminium heat spreader to cool the memory. So this shouldn't impact GPU thermals all that much, but it will be interesting to see if there is any difference when it comes to memory temperatures. As for the VRM, we have another aluminium heat spreader here, and this one attaches directly to the primary heatsink. Speaking of which, there are 3 fin arrays, all of which are connected via 4 6mm thick copper heat pipes. Moving over to the fan shroud, we find 2 First D. Yes, the company is called First D. Anyway, we have 2 DC brushless fans, and these are the same models used by most of the XFX graphics cards. And that's good news, as they are very easy to replace out of warranty. You're only looking at around $10 to $15 to replace them. Then over on the PCB, we find a standard 7+ 2-phase VRM, and this is the same configuration used by AMD's reference card. Given the 5700 XT's very limited overclocking headroom, the power delivery here is more than adequate, so there's no need to make any upgrades. So now that we've gone over the THICC 2's design, let's see how it performed in our test system, starting with the F1 2019 stress test. Out of the box, after an hour-long loop, the card peaked at just 66 degrees in a 21-degree room inside the Corsair Crystal 570X, fully populated with 120mm fans. This is a huge 18-degree drop in peak operating temperature when compared to the AMD reference card, which peaked at 84 degrees under the exact same conditions. At this temperature, the THICC 2 maintained an average core clock frequency of roughly 1980 MHz. There is quite a lot of variance in clock speed with these 500 series GPUs, but this was about the same frequency we saw from the reference model. It is worth noting that the fan spun at around 2100 RPM, and that does make the THICC 2 quite a bit louder than the Red Devil, which typically saw a fan speed of just 1400 RPM, and I'll compare the temperature and operating volume data directly in a moment. Just quickly, for those of you wondering, flicking the THICC2 over to the silent BIOS saw no real change in operating temperature or volume, and this was of course after a full system reset. The card still peaked at 66 degrees, the fan still spun at around 2100 RPM, but the average boost clock did seem to drop down to around 1900 MHz. So although the card was slightly downclocked, we saw no reduction in fan speed. Before moving on to overclocking, let's talk about the fan stop feature of this graphics card. When the GPU is idle or under very light load, the fans don't spin. You can see here that the fan speed is reported as 65,535 RPM, but obviously it's not spinning almost as fast as a turbo's turbine. The software just isn't reporting 0 RPM correctly. Anyway, that's not the issue. What is the issue here is what happens when you go from an idle state to load. Oddly, the fans don't activate until the GPU temperature hits 100 degrees, and this causes a few problems. Firstly, the card gets unnecessarily hot. The backplate becomes scorching hot, and you definitely receive a good burn if you touched it. Secondly, the GPU clock speed drops right down below 1 GHz. In fact, I saw it clock as low as 300 MHz at times, and this is when gaming. This means when you fire up a game for the first time, the card will begin to throttle after roughly a minute and a half. Then for about another minute, the card will throttle quite badly, resulting in lost performance as the GPU temperatures climb. Then a little over 2 minutes into your game, the fan begins to spin up. Problem with that being, it cranks up to 3200 RPM, where it makes a real racket. I recorded an operating volume of 62 decibels. The fan continued to spin at around 3200 RPM for the next 40 seconds before very slowly winding back down to a sustained 2100 RPM. All said and done, this process took 6 minutes from start to finish. This obviously is a big problem, but thankfully it doesn't happen all that often when gaming. In fact, it'll only happen when going from a long idle period to heavy load. So once it happens once when gaming, it won't happen again. Still, this really isn't good enough, and XFX really do need to fix it. As for overclocking, we're still looking at a voltage cap of 1200 millivolts and a frequency cap of 2150 MHz, which AMD applies at the BIOS level. With the limits reached, we saw a peak operating temperature of 73 degrees, but unfortunately this did see the fans cranked up to 2800 RPM, and that did make the card quite loud. Although we're targeting 2150 MHz, the card maintained a core clock speed of around 2 GHz, so that's just a mere 8% increase in frequency from stock. The GDDR6 memory also doesn't respond that well to overclocking, and for our sample, even increasing the memory to just 900 MHz caused artifacting, so I just decided to leave the memory alone. Okay, so let's move into a few quick benchmark graphs. As usual, we're testing with our Core i9 1900K GPU test rig. The CPU has been overclocked to 5 GHz, and we have 16 GB of DDR4 3400 memory. The latest drivers available at the time of testing have been used, and for this one, we just have a few select games to look at. I'm just going to blast through these game benchmarks as they don't really tell us much other than the fact that the XFX THICC2 performs like any other 5700 XT, and we see that here in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. The same thing can be seen when testing with Forza Horizon 4. The Red Devil was a little punchier out of the box, but we're only talking about 2 to 3 FPS here. Finally, we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This time we see the THICC2 is just a frame down on the Red Devil, making it 2 FPS faster than the Evoke OC. Now, when it comes to power consumption, I was surprised to find the THICC2 consuming slightly more power than the Red Devil. It's not exactly a big increase, but given the performance, I was expecting to find it somewhere between the Evoke OC and Red Devil. That said, when looking at total system draw, it basically matched the other two 5700 XT graphics cards. Here is a direct temperature comparison with the other cards tested. After now, the THICC2 matched the MSI RTX 2070 Super Gaming X Trio with a peak operating temperature of 67 degrees, which sounds rather impressive, and it would be if it weren't for the fact that the fans were spinning more than twice as fast. This also means that while the THICC2 was 3 degrees cooler than the Red Devil, it was also quite a bit louder, and we'll look at operating volume now. So despite matching the thermal performance of the MSI RTX 2070 Gaming X Trio, the THICC2 was 6 decibels louder in our test, making it just a single decibel quieter than the Evoke OC and 2 decibels quieter than AMD's reference design. Still, it was a few degrees cooler than the Evoke and slightly quieter, so it's not exactly a bad result, but it's also not better than the Red Devil. Perhaps with some fan tuning you could get a similar balance between performance and operating volume, but sadly, for now at least, the silent BIOS doesn't achieve that balance. Okay, so that's how the XFX Radeon RX 5700 XT THICC 2 performs, and I have to say, bar a single quirk with the fan stop feature, it is quite a nice graphics card. If anything, I feel it is tuned a little too aggressively towards thermal performance. I would like to see XFX reduce the fan speed just a bit. That'll make the card run a little bit hotter, but it will be a few decibels quieter, and for me, that would be an optimal scenario for this graphics card. The fan stop issue, where the GPU hits 100 degrees before the fans actually turn on, which causes long periods of throttling followed by a long period of excessive fan noise, really isn't acceptable, but it won't be difficult to address either. XFX just needs to change the temperature threshold from 100 degrees down to 60 degrees, for example. Existing models will need a BIOS update though if they are to implement this kind of fix, and I suppose while they're at it, they might as well fix the silent mode so that it actually does something. But as far as looks go, the THICC 2 is one of the best looking graphics cards I've ever seen. So that goes just beyond 5700 XTs. I think it really is one of the best looking graphics cards I've seen. I really like the design, and it should fit right in with pretty much any build. And I'm also happy to see no RGB lighting on this model because I don't think it really needs it. But if you do like your graphics card to put on a bit of a light show, then this model may leave you a bit disappointed. Finally, as for whether or not you should buy this thing, really comes down to the price. The Red Devil is priced at $440 US, which I feel is a really reasonable price for a 5700 XT of that caliber. The THICC 2 on the other hand, that'll really need to come in at no more than $430 US. And this is currently what MSI is asking for their Evoke OC. The THICC is a much better graphics card than the Evoke, but not quite as good as the Red Devil, at least not until a few of those issues we spoke of get fixed up. So the price really will determine just how desirable this graphics card is. Right now, availability of AIB 5700 XT graphics cards is a bit sketchy, but I'm hoping that situation will improve over the next few weeks. Anyway, that's going to do it for this one. Actually, before I wrap this up, you may have noticed I'm wearing our new embroidered Hardware Unboxed hoodie. You can grab that over at our merch store. Tim's been doing a good job of pushing the merch lately, so I got my hoodie in and it's my turn. I thought I'll do it in this video and hopefully I can outsell Tim. He's got a few weeks head start on me, so yeah, let's see if in this one video I can beat Tim, because that's important. That way I'd be the #1 merch salesman for Hardware Unboxed. So let's see if we can make that happen. But if you can't afford to buy merch or you don't want to, that's fine. We also have a Patreon page. You can sign up there, access to monthly live stream. We've got exclusive Q&A, Discord chat, heap of other cool perks. It's really good fun over there. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.